Mr. President, sir, and all of the I express my appreciation to all of you here in this room for your warm welcome, and those outside have made me feel very much at home. I was saying to your president just before coming into this room that it was 20 years ago that I spoke at Oxford, exactly at this time. I saw someone nodding, but you couldn't have been born then. I believe it was in this room. At least it was a room about this size. And as I thought back over those 20 years, and the subject which I am supposed to address today, it occurred to me that it might be well to look quickly over those years as to how the world has changed in that 20-year period. It has changed in many ways in your country and in mine. It has changed in many ways in the world, all parts of the world, but particularly in that area that affects the possibility of whether you may grow up in this last generation of the 20th century in a world in which there can be both peace and freedom. I think it is well for us to examine what has happened to the world in that respect. 20 years ago, the United States and what was called the free world had an enormous advantage over what was called the communist world militarily, particularly in the nuclear area. The United States had a strategic nuclear superiority that was unquestioned of about 10 to 1. And in the European theater, there was not as great a superiority, but it was significant, at least sufficient. In the 20 years since then, that gap has totally disappeared. The Soviet Union is today substantially ahead of the United States in terms of nuclear missiles or vehicles for delivery, and enormously ahead in terms of throw weight of nuclear weapons. The United States still has superiority in the fields of numbers of warheads and also in accuracy. However, the Soviet Union is rapidly closing those gaps because at this time, despite what you may read this morning in the paper with regard to the Soviet Union limiting its military expenses, in terms of military hardware, the Soviet Union today is spending annually 75% more per year than is the United States. Geographically, in that 20-year period, we find that in every area of the world, the communist powers have extended their domination. In no area of the world do we see a nation which was then communist and which is now non-communist. Briefly, Cuba in 1959, and then even in the period 4 years ago when I left office, in that period, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, South Yemen, several countries in Africa. Now, when we look at that record, there is a tendency in those circles that are sophisticated in foreign policy to throw up their hands and say that not only have we been losing, but that we are going to lose, certainly unless the trend is changed. I recall many years ago, in 1953, shortly after I became vice president. General Eisenhower, as president, was telling me something from his own experience. We had some problems then in the world, and there was a tendency to be too much concerned, he thought, about the strength of those who might be our potential adversaries. And he said, I learned as a general, commanding the great forces in Europe, that it is important to know the strengths of your adversary and your own strengths and weaknesses. But too often commanders do not analyze the weaknesses of their potential adversaries. Let's look briefly at that side of the picture. It is not often commented upon in the reports even that you may read. Economically, the advantage of those who live in what I call the West, and let us, for purposes of definition today in our discussion, refer to the West as the industrial West. And I include in that Western Europe, including, of course, Great Britain, the United States and Canada, and also Japan. The West, including those countries, has an advantage over the entire communist bloc, the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe, of almost 5 to 1. Western Europe, without the United States and without Japan, has an advantage over all of the Soviet bloc countries of over 2 to 1. The Soviet Union is having very difficult problems with its economy, partly due to the fact that they are putting such a great amount into armaments, and partly because of the inefficiency of their agriculture, and partly because of the inefficiency of much of their technological development in manufacturing and other areas. This, of course, has caused problems that are not too well known, descent within their own country, of people who want more consumer goods. Then, in the geopolitical sense, all of us are aware of the fact that the Soviet Union and the other great communist giant, the People's Republic of China, are at odds and have, in my view, probably irreconcilable differences in our time. In other areas, we find that Vietnam and Cambodia are virtually on the brink of war, with all the repercussions that might flow from that. There are stirrings of discontent, independence in Eastern Europe. That has occurred before. There are more now. You, of course, have read this morning of what is happening in Romania, where President Ceausescu is taking a very independent line in foreign policy, although anyone who has visited his country knows that he runs a very tight shop insofar as a communist economy is concerned. But in Eastern Europe, we see the truth of something that was said many years ago by an American Secretary of State. Never in the history of civilization has there been a system that has had more success in extending its domination over nations and less success in gaining the approval of the people of those nations. That is the story in Poland. That is the story in Hungary. That is the story in Romania and the other countries, for the most part, in Eastern Europe. I mentioned Africa a moment ago. As far as Africa is concerned, black Africa particularly, it is not a fertile soil for communism, the idea. It is, however, an inviting target for aggression, internal and external, and for dictatorial government because of the lack of governmental activities of experience which enable them to govern in another way. And so as we look at these various factors, we then come to the key question. And that question is, why is there talk about the decline of the West? Why is there so much pessimism in the West? Sir Robert Thomson, a distinguished analyst of world affairs whom I consulted a great deal during the difficult years I was trying to bring the American involvement in Vietnam to an end, recently made this comment, that a nation's strength equals its resources plus manpower times will. There is no question about the resources of the West. We already know its advantage is enormous. There is no question also about our military capability. We may be behind in certain areas, but with the enormous advantage that we have insofar as economic power is concerned, if a race is to be had, if we cannot have control of arms, we will win it. And the Soviet knows it. But there is a question that has been raised by many, Solzhenitsyn at Harvard, other scholars in America, in Britain, and in other countries in Europe. Is there the will, the faith, the belief? I think I would analyze the problem of will in perhaps 4, maybe 5 categories. First, there are those who are the defeatists. They throw up their hands, they believe that the tide of the future rests on the other side, that we're going to lose. So we might as well relax and enjoy it to the extent that we can. And then there are those who are the fearful. They believe that while we might be able to avoid defeat, that the risk is too great, the risk of a nuclear holocaust. And so you come out with the formula, better be red than dead. And then there, of course, there is that group of people that I would categorize very respectfully as being naive. That really, it doesn't make that much difference. Communism isn't that bad. And that is combined with a fourth group who simply have lost faith in your system, in ours, in the values of the West. The very profound scholar, George Kennan, whom you have read about and studied, who developed the theory of containment immediately after World War II, has recently written that, speaking of the United States at least, that America no longer has anything to say to the world. We are too decadent, too corrupt. Drugs, pornography, all the sins, of course, of which you were aware. And that as far as we're concerned, and as far as the West is concerned, and America in particular, we should turn inward, limit our activities abroad, rather than attempting to teach others to do as we do. Now, that is one point of view, those that I have named. Let me come to my own and then turn as soon as I can to your questions. Needless to say, I do not share those views. I am a realist, a pragmatist. I do know that we face great challenges, particularly in the military field, but I believe we have the power. I believe we can develop the will. I believe we should, and I believe it deeply, and I shall always believe it till the day I die, that with everything that is wrong in our society and in the free societies, we advertise our weaknesses, while in theirs they bury theirs. I believe that what we stand for is worth saving. I'm not saying to this young generation, worth dying for. I do not believe there will be a third world war. I think it can be avoided. But I will say to you, what we stand for is worth living for. That is what I would like to leave to this young generation of leaders. As I look across this room, I know you're very young. You didn't seem that young 20 years ago. And yet I know there is great potential in this room. I think of what you, this institution, has meant to America, what has meant to Britain. 5 of your officers have become British prime ministers. I realize, too, that I'm in a very honored position to be here. But Mr. Moylan dropped a little hint to me that this was simply the preliminary bout before the main event when you elect your own president. What you have meant to America, maybe some of you are not aware, but included among the Rhodes Scholars who have made it in our country politically, a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, a former Secretary of State, a former Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a present Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League. And he is so brainy, he'll probably make it in politics, too. And finally, a member of the most powerful group in all of America in our diffusion or balance of powers, Mr. Howard K. Smith, the distinguished commentator for ABC. Now, I regret to say that I cannot report to you that any one of your colleagues from this institution ever made it as president of the United States, that is. But I will confidently predict to you that before the end of this century, one of them probably will, maybe one of you. And so finally, Mr. President, I come to the questions. And in doing so, I just recall that 20 years ago, the first question right out of the box came from up in the gallery. And I was, of course, waiting for something profound about how are British-American relations going to be in the next 15 years and so forth. It was a rather interesting question. He said, "Mr. Vice President, why are you here? For a loan?"